The coffee shop was busy that afternoon. A mix of the usual chatter, clinking cups, and the hum of the espresso machine filling the air. Carlos moved behind the counter with practiced ease, his hands working quickly yet carefully as he prepared orders. His uniform was clean and his hair tied back neatly. There was a calm rhythm to the way he worked, a kind of quiet professionalism that came from years of experience in customer service. Despite the busyness, Carlos always made an effort to greet each customer with a smile. He liked seeing people start their day on a positive note, even if it was just through a simple good morning or a quick joke. Today, though, there was a tension in the air that made him a little uneasy, though he couldn't yet put his finger on why. A man entered wearing a pressed suit and carrying an air of impatience. He didn't look around the shop or smile at anyone. Instead, he walked straight up to the counter, tapping his foot as he waited. Carlos noticed him immediately and prepared for another busy interaction. He greeted the man politely. "Hi there, welcome. What can I get started for you today?" The man glanced at the menu, frowning as if it was the most difficult thing he had ever seen. "I want a latte," he said, his tone sharp and clipped. He didn't offer any pleasantries, and Carlos noticed the irritation in his voice. He nodded politely and began preparing the drink. As Carlos worked, the man continued to mutter under his breath, clearly unhappy with the speed at which the line was moving. He leaned forward slightly, peering over the counter in a way that made Carlos feel uncomfortable. Carlos kept his focus on the task, making sure every step of the drink was perfect. He steamed the milk carefully, poured it with skill, and added the precise amount of espresso. When he handed the drink over, the man snatched it from his hands without saying thank you. "This isn't hot enough," he complained immediately, holding the cup up as if to prove a point. Carlos took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had dealt with complaints before, but the man's tone felt unnecessarily harsh. "I'm sorry about that," Carlos said gently. "I can make you a fresh one right away, hotter this time. Would you like me to do that?" The man's frown deepened. "I don't want to wait. Can't you just heat this up?" he demanded, waving the cup in the air. Carlos paused, considering his options. He knew reheating a latte wasn't ideal. It could change the taste, but he also didn't want to argue. "I can heat it carefully, or I can make a new one for you. I want to make sure it tastes perfect," he said. The man huffed, clearly frustrated, and muttered something under his breath that Carlos barely caught. It sounded like a comment about the barista's abilities. Carlos felt a twinge of hurt but quickly pushed it aside. He knew that staying professional was the only way to handle the situation. He carefully placed the cup in the microwave for a few seconds, watching it closely so it wouldn't overheat. As he handed the cup back, he tried to offer a small smile. "Here you go, sir. This should be just the right temperature now." The man took it, still scowling, and took a sip. For a moment, there was silence. Carlos hoped the drink was finally acceptable. Instead, the man set the cup down and leaned on the counter, glaring. "This is still not right," he said. "I don't understand why it's so difficult to get a simple latte." Carlos felt the tension in the room increase. Other customers had started to notice the exchange, some glancing nervously, others whispering quietly. He took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Let me make you a new one, and I'll personally make sure it's perfect," he said. The man's eyes narrowed. "Why is it always such a hassle with you people?" he snapped. The words stung, and Carlos felt the weight of them, but he didn't respond. Instead, he focused on the task, determined to handle the situation professionally. He started preparing a fresh latte, moving carefully to ensure everything was correct. As he worked, he noticed a man sitting quietly in the corner, watching the scene unfold. The man had a calm presence, almost serene, and Carlos felt a slight sense of relief just from seeing someone who didn't seem bothered by the chaos. He kept his focus on the drink, steaming the milk to the perfect texture, pouring it over the espresso with precision. When he handed the new latte over, he spoke softly, trying to ease the tension. "Here you go, sir. I've made this one especially for you. I hope it's exactly what you're looking for." The man took a sip, paused, and finally gave a reluctant nod. Carlos allowed himself a brief sigh of relief. The situation seemed to have calmed, at least for the moment. The impatient customer didn't stop there, though. He continued to mutter complaints, criticizing everything from the way Carlos had poured the milk to the temperature of the espresso. Carlos listened silently, responding only when necessary, his patience tested but unwavering. He knew that losing his cool would only make things worse. Other customers began to offer quiet smiles and supportive glances to Carlos. Some whispered encouragement to each other. Clearly impressed by how calm he remained, Carlos felt a small spark of gratitude for their presence, knowing that he wasn't completely alone in this uncomfortable situation. As the man finally moved toward the door, muttering under his breath about the poor service, Carlos felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He wiped down the counter, took a deep breath, and tried to shake off the tension. It had been a difficult encounter, but he had handled it with dignity, and that mattered more than anything. The man in the corner, who had been watching the entire exchange, finally stood up and approached Carlos. He had a friendly smile and a quiet confidence. "You handled that really well," he said softly. Carlos looked up, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you," he replied, still a little breathless from the encounter. "It wasn't easy, but I just try to stay calm." The man nodded, his eyes kind. "I can see that. Not everyone would manage it like you did." Carlos felt a small sense of pride, a reminder that his professionalism and patience didn't go unnoticed. He realized that even in difficult moments, there could be unexpected support and acknowledgement. As the coffee shop returned to its usual rhythm, the atmosphere slowly lightened. Customers laughed softly at small jokes, the barista team moved with practiced efficiency, and the earlier tension faded into the background. Carlos continued to serve drinks, but now with a renewed sense of confidence. He knew that challenges would come, but he also knew that staying calm, polite, and professional could make all the difference. By the time the afternoon rush started to fade, Carlos had served dozens of customers, each interaction smoother than the last. The man who had watched from the corner lingered for a few more minutes, quietly enjoying his coffee. Before leaving without drawing attention to himself, Carlos couldn't help but feel a sense of curiosity about him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the remaining tasks of the day. In the quiet moments after the rush, Carlos took a moment to reflect on the events. He thought about the impatient customer, the stares of other patrons, and the man who had offered encouragement. He realized that every day brought new challenges, but it also brought moments of connection and recognition. Even in the most stressful situations, there was the potential for kindness and understanding. Carlos wiped down the counter one last time, straightened his apron, and took a deep breath. The shop was calm now, the earlier chaos replaced by a peaceful rhythm. He felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that he had navigated a difficult encounter with grace. As he prepared for the next round of customers, he reminded himself that patience, professionalism, and a positive attitude could turn even the most trying day into a meaningful experience. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light across the shop. Carlos looked around at the familiar faces, the empty tables waiting for new patrons, and the gentle hum of conversation. He smiled softly to himself, ready to continue his day, knowing that no matter what challenges came next, he had the strength to handle them with dignity and care. The next morning, the coffee shop was buzzing again. The sun poured through the windows, casting a warm glow over the tables where customers chatted quietly, some typing on laptops, others scrolling through their phones. Carlos arrived early, ready to start his shift, tying back his hair and straightening his apron. He liked being prepared. He knew that no matter how calm the morning looked, surprises could happen at any moment. By mid-morning, the shop had filled with a steady crowd. Carlos moved with quiet efficiency, greeting each customer and preparing drinks with care. He enjoyed the rhythm of it, the way the steam hissed from the milk frother and the scent of freshly ground coffee filled the air. There was a sense of comfort in the familiar routine, a feeling that even in a busy world, some things remained constant. The door opened, and a man in a crisp suit walked in. Carlos recognized him instantly. It was the same impatient customer from yesterday. His eyes scanned the shop, and his expression was clearly one of annoyance. Carlos felt a small knot form in his stomach, but he took a deep breath and forced a polite smile. He had handled him before, and he could do it again. "Good morning," Carlos said, his tone steady. "Welcome back. What can I get for you today?" The man's eyes narrowed. "I don't know why this is so difficult, but I want the same latte as yesterday, and it better be perfect this time," he said sharply. Carlos nodded and began preparing the drink, his hands moving carefully to get every step just right. As he worked, the man's voice rose slightly, complaining about the line, the noise, and the people in the shop. Carlos remained calm, repeating polite phrases like, "I'm sorry for the wait, and I'll make sure it's exactly right." Other customers in line exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering to each other about how rude the man was being. Carlos noticed the man leaning on the counter, watching his every move. The barista felt the weight of his gaze but refused to let it break his focus. He steamed the milk, poured it over the espresso, and added a delicate layer of foam on top. Every detail mattered, and Carlos wanted this drink to be perfect. When he handed the cup over, the man immediately took a sip and frowned. "Still not hot enough," he said, his tone sharper than before. Carlos felt a pang of frustration but quickly pushed it aside. He knew reacting would only make things worse. "I can heat it for you," he said gently, "or make a fresh one. I want it to be perfect for you." The man waved him off, clearly agitated, and muttered under his breath as he held the cup. Carlos carefully reheated the latte, watching it closely so it wouldn't get too hot. He placed it back in front of the man, offering a small smile. "Here you go," he said softly. "This should be just right." The man took a sip and gave a reluctant nod, though his expression still showed impatience. Carlos allowed himself a brief sigh of relief, hoping the encounter was finally over. Other customers had been watching silently, their eyes following every interaction. Some were clearly impressed with Carlos's calmness, while others seemed anxious about the tension in the shop. A few had quietly pulled out their phones, capturing snippets of the situation without drawing attention. The energy in the room was thick, charged with the mix of frustration and admiration. Just then, Carlos noticed the man in the corner from yesterday. He was sitting quietly, sipping his coffee and observing the scene. There was a calm presence about him, something steady and reassuring. Carlos felt a subtle sense of relief knowing someone else saw what was happening. The man didn't intervene, but his silent support was comforting. The impatient customer continued muttering complaints about the foam, the temperature, and even the size of the cup. Carlos remained focused, responding only when necessary, and maintaining a tone that was calm and polite. He wiped down the counter, organized the supplies, and made sure the workspace was clean, all while keeping an eye on the escalating situation. As the man's frustration grew, he started raising his voice, calling Carlos's skills into question, and criticizing the way the drinks were prepared. The words were sharp and personal, meant to provoke a reaction. Carlos felt the tension rising, but he took a deep breath and reminded himself that his professionalism mattered more than his pride. He continued to move with careful precision, each motion deliberate and controlled. Customers began to shift in their seats, some glancing nervously at the man, others whispering about his behavior. The atmosphere was charged, and the hum of normal conversation was replaced by the tense silence of anticipation. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the next moment, wondering how Carlos would respond and whether the situation would spiral out of control. Carlos finished preparing the man's latte and handed it over with a polite nod. "I've made this one carefully, and I hope it's exactly what you're looking for," he said. The man took a sip and paused, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, there was hope that the tension might ease, but the man's eyes narrowed again and he muttered something under his breath, clearly still unhappy. It was at this moment that the man in the corner quietly got up and moved closer to the counter. Carlos noticed him but didn't immediately recognize who he was. The man's presence was calm, almost magnetic, and he seemed to radiate quiet authority. The impatient customer noticed him too, and his eyes flicked nervously in the man's direction. The man in the corner spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I think it's important to treat people with respect," he said softly but firmly. The words carried weight, and the shop seemed to grow quieter as everyone listened. The impatient customer looked taken aback, clearly not expecting to be addressed in such a calm, direct manner. Carlos felt a small sense of hope. Someone else was standing up, not with anger, but with calm authority. It was a reminder that even in tense situations, kindness and support could appear from unexpected places. The other customers shifted, some nodding in agreement, sensing that the tone in the shop was beginning to change. The impatient customer stumbled over his words, clearly unsure how to respond. He muttered something about the latte, his voice losing some of its earlier sharpness. Carlos kept his focus, maintaining his professional demeanor while the man in the corner continued to watch quietly. There was a subtle tension, but it was different now, a sense that the situation might be resolved without further conflict. Carlos continued to serve the remaining customers, each interaction smoother than before. He felt a renewed sense of determination, knowing that he could handle difficult moments with grace and patience. The man in the corner remained nearby, a silent presence that offered reassurance without needing to interfere. As the morning progressed, the coffee shop slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Customers laughed softly, baristas moved with practiced efficiency, and the earlier tension faded into the background. Carlos kept glancing at the man in the corner, curious about who he was and why he had chosen to stand up in such a subtle, powerful way. By the time the midday rush approached, the impatient customer had finally left, muttering complaints that were now quieter and less sharp. Carlos wiped down the counter, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The encounter had tested his patience, but he had maintained his professionalism and dignity, and that mattered more than anything. In the quiet moments after the rush, Carlos reflected on the morning. He thought about the impatient customer, the silent support of the man in the corner, and the small signs of encouragement from other patrons. He realized that even in difficult situations, moments of connection and recognition could appear, reminding him why he stayed calm and patient. The man in the corner finally left, giving Carlos a small nod as he walked out the door. Carlos returned the gesture, feeling a sense of gratitude for the quiet support. He knew that challenges would come again, but he also knew that staying calm, professional, and kind could make all the difference. As he continued his work, preparing drinks and greeting customers, Carlos felt a renewed sense of confidence. The morning had been difficult, but it had also been a reminder of the power of patience and composure. Every customer, every interaction, was an opportunity to show kindness and professionalism. Even in the face of rudeness, the coffee shop settled into its usual rhythm, with the familiar sounds of conversation, the clinking of cups, and the hum of the espresso machine creating a comforting background. Carlos moved with ease, ready for whatever challenges might come next, knowing that he had the strength to handle them with grace and dignity. By the time the afternoon arrived, Carlos had served dozens of customers without incident. He felt proud of how he had managed the morning, grateful for the unexpected support of the man who had observed him. It was a reminder that even in difficult moments, there were people who recognized effort, professionalism, and kindness, and that recognition could make all the difference. The afternoon brought a new wave of customers into the coffee shop. The sun had moved, casting long, golden beams across the floor and highlighting the steam rising from freshly poured drinks. Carlos had regained his focus, moving through the crowd of patrons with the same quiet professionalism he always did. He enjoyed the rhythm of preparing coffee, the little details of frothing milk, pouring espresso, and watching the foam curl perfectly on top. It was a craft he took pride in. The calm was interrupted when the familiar sound of the door opening echoed through the shop. Carlos glanced up and his heart sank slightly. The impatient customer had returned. He strode in with purpose, eyes scanning the room, clearly intent on causing more trouble. Carlos took a deep breath and reminded himself to remain calm. He had handled this situation twice before and could do it again. "Welcome back," Carlos said, keeping his tone steady and polite. "What can I get for you today?" He tried to keep his voice neutral, betraying none of the tension he felt. The man waved dismissively, his frown deepening. "I want exactly the same latte as before. No mistakes. It better be perfect." Carlos nodded and began preparing the drink, paying careful attention to every detail. He steamed the milk with care, made sure the espresso shot was precise, and poured with the precision he had honed over years. As he worked, the man grew louder, muttering complaints about the line, the noise, and the movement of other customers. His voice carried, and a few nearby patrons glanced over nervously. Carlos remained calm, speaking softly whenever necessary, repeating polite phrases like, "I apologize for the wait," and "I'll make sure it's just right." He knew that responding with anger would only escalate the situation. The man leaned over the counter, watching Carlos intently. His gaze was sharp, almost as if he were trying to catch a mistake. Carlos felt the pressure but refused to let it distract him. Every movement, every pour was deliberate. He was determined to deliver the best possible drink, despite the hostility in the room. When the latte was ready, Carlos handed it over with a calm smile. "Here you go. I hope this is exactly what you're looking for." The man took a sip, paused, and then set the cup down with a sigh. His expression was hard to read, but he muttered that it was warmer, though still not perfect in his opinion. Carlos felt the frustration building around him, but he stayed focused. He had learned that patience and professionalism were the most effective responses. Suddenly, the man grabbed a pastry from the display case, claiming it wasn't fresh enough. He placed it on the counter, pointing at it and speaking in a raised voice. Carlos's colleagues exchanged worried glances, unsure how to respond. Carlos stepped forward, keeping his voice calm. "I can offer you a fresh one," he said. "I want to make sure it's perfect for you." The man waved him off, clearly agitated, and continued to complain. Carlos noticed the man in the corner from earlier, quietly observing the chaos. There was a calmness in the man's demeanor, a quiet strength that seemed to counterbalance the tension. Carlos felt a small sense of relief, knowing someone else was paying attention and silently supporting him. The impatient customer's complaints grew more personal. He criticized Carlos's skills, the way he handled the latte, and even the efficiency of the service. The words were harsh, meant to provoke a reaction. Carlos felt the tension rise but forced himself to remain composed. He knew that keeping calm was more powerful than engaging in an argument. He began preparing a fresh pastry, carefully slicing it and placing it on a clean plate. "Here's a fresh one," he said, keeping his tone steady. "I hope this is what you're looking for." The man took it, still muttering complaints, but he seemed slightly less hostile. Carlos allowed himself a brief moment of hope, but he knew better than to relax completely. Other customers had been watching in silence, some glancing nervously, others whispering to each other. There was a sense of anticipation in the room, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The coffee shop, once a place of routine and calm, had become charged with tension. Carlos noticed the man in the corner shift slightly, his attention unwavering. There was something about his presence that reminded Carlos to stay calm and professional. It was a quiet, unspoken support, a reminder that even in the most difficult situations, there could be allies. The impatient customer, frustrated that his complaints were not getting the reaction he wanted, raised his voice even more. He began pointing out every minor detail in the shop, criticizing everything from the placement of cups to the way other customers were sitting. Carlos felt a pang of anxiety, but he reminded himself to stay grounded. He focused on completing his tasks with precision, responding only when necessary and maintaining a calm demeanor. It was then that the man in the corner quietly stood up and moved closer to the counter. Carlos noticed him but did not immediately recognize who he was. There was a calm authority in the man's presence that seemed to change the energy in the room. The impatient customer noticed too, and his eyes flicked nervously toward him. The man spoke, his voice steady and firm. "I don't think it's fair to treat someone this way," he said softly but clearly, addressing the impatient customer. The words carried weight, and the shop seemed to quiet down as everyone listened. The man's calm confidence was a contrast to the raised voices and frustration, and it drew attention without creating conflict. Carlos felt a sense of relief. The situation, while still tense, had shifted. The man in the corner was not confrontational, but his presence had a stabilizing effect. Other customers seemed to recognize it too, their expressions softening and their whispers quieting. The atmosphere began to feel less hostile, more controlled. The impatient customer looked caught off guard. He muttered something about the latte, his voice faltering. The words were less sharp, less accusatory than before. Carlos maintained his professional composure, handing over another drink with a polite smile. "Here's a fresh one just for you," he said, keeping his tone calm. The man in the corner remained near the counter, observing quietly. His calm presence reminded Carlos that patience, professionalism, and quiet dignity could change the dynamic of a difficult situation. The impatient customer, sensing the shift, began to soften slightly, though his complaints didn't disappear completely. As Carlos continued serving other customers, he noticed small gestures of support, a nod, a quiet smile, a glance of acknowledgement. It was a reminder that professionalism and kindness were noticed, even if not everyone spoke up. The man in the corner's subtle support had a ripple effect throughout the shop. influencing both customers and staff. By the time the afternoon rush began to slow, the impatient customer had finally left, muttering complaints that were quieter and less sharp. Carlos wiped down the counter, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The encounter had tested his patience, but he had maintained his composure and professionalism, and that mattered more than anything. In the quiet moments that followed, Carlos reflected on the events of the day. He thought about the impatient customer, the silent support of the man in the corner, and the small signs of encouragement from other patrons. He realized that even in stressful situations, moments of connection and recognition could appear, offering reassurance and strength. The man in the corner finally left, giving Carlos a small nod as he walked out the door. Carlos returned the gesture, feeling grateful for the quiet support. He knew challenges would come again, but he also knew that staying calm, professional, and kind could make all the difference. Carlos continued his work, preparing drinks and greeting customers with the same quiet efficiency. He felt a renewed sense of confidence, knowing that even in difficult moments his patience and professionalism could guide him through. The coffee shop returned to its normal rhythm, with the familiar sounds of conversation, clinking cups, and the hum of the espresso machine creating a comforting background. As the afternoon progressed, Carlos served dozens of customers without incident. Each interaction was smoother than the last. He felt proud of how he had managed the situation, grateful for the unexpected support he had received. The experience was a reminder that even in moments of tension, kindness, patience, and composure could make all the difference. The sun began to lower in the sky, casting a warm glow across the shop. Carlos wiped down the counters one last time, straightened his apron, and took a deep breath. The day had been challenging, but he had handled it with grace and dignity. He knew that tomorrow would bring new customers, new challenges, and new opportunities to show kindness and professionalism. And he was ready for them. The late afternoon brought a quiet lull to the coffee shop. The sun hung low, casting a warm golden light through the windows, and the usual hum of conversation filled the air. Carlos moved behind the counter, cleaning and organizing, keeping the space ready for the next wave of customers. He enjoyed these calm moments when the chaos of the day paused just enough to catch his breath. But the peace didn't last long. The door swung open with a harsh push, and Carlos looked up. The impatient customer had returned, his face twisted with irritation. He marched directly to the counter, ignoring the other patrons, and Carlos felt the familiar knot of tension in his stomach. He took a deep breath and forced a polite smile. "Welcome back," he said, keeping his voice calm. "What can I get for you today?" The man slammed his hand on the counter. "I want the latte exactly like yesterday," he snapped. "And I want it perfect this time, no excuses." Carlos nodded and began preparing the drink, his hands moving with practiced precision. He steamed the milk carefully, poured the espresso perfectly, and added a delicate layer of foam. He tried to focus on the work, blocking out the man's harsh words. As Carlos worked, the man grew louder, complaining about the noise, the service, and the people around him. His voice carried through the shop, and the other customers shifted uneasily in their seats. Carlos responded only when necessary, speaking softly and politely, maintaining a calm demeanor. He knew that reacting with anger would only escalate the situation further. The man leaned over the counter, scrutinizing Carlos's every move. His eyes were sharp, trying to catch a mistake, his tone dripping with impatience. Carlos felt the tension in the air grow, but he refused to let it distract him. He placed the finished latte in front of the man with a gentle smile. "Here you go," he said. "I've made this one carefully. I hope it's exactly what you're looking for." The man took a sip and immediately frowned, setting it down with a thump. "This isn't right," the man complained, raising his voice. "I don't know why it's so difficult to get a simple latte. The foam is wrong, the temperature is off, and you clearly don't know what you're doing." Carlos felt a stab of frustration but kept his voice calm. "I apologize for the inconvenience," he said. "I can make a new one for you right away. I want it to be perfect." The man's face twisted in anger. He grabbed a pastry from the display, pointing at it and complaining it wasn't fresh enough. Carlos took a deep breath and carefully selected a fresh one from the tray, placing it on a clean plate. "Here's a fresh pastry," he said softly. "I hope this is what you're looking for." The man muttered something under his breath, clearly still dissatisfied, but he took the plate. Other customers had been watching silently, some glancing nervously, others whispering to each other. There was a tense energy in the shop, a sense of anticipation. Everyone seemed to be waiting to see what would happen next. The coffee shop, once a place of calm routine, had become a stage for conflict. Carlos noticed the man from the corner, the quiet observer who had been there the previous day and earlier today. He was standing closer now, watching intently, a calm presence in contrast to the chaos. Carlos felt a small sense of relief. The man's presence was reassuring, a silent reminder that he was not alone. The impatient customer's complaints escalated further, growing more personal and cruel. He criticized Carlos's abilities, the way he handled the drinks, and even the store itself. His words were sharp, designed to provoke and humiliate. Carlos felt the tension rise, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He focused on his work, maintaining professionalism and refusing to engage in anger. Then the man in the corner stepped forward. His presence commanded attention without any effort. He was calm, collected, and exuded a quiet authority that seemed to make the entire room take notice. The impatient customer noticed him too, his gaze flicking nervously toward the man. "I think it's important to treat people with respect," the man said softly but firmly, addressing the impatient customer directly. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. The room fell quiet. The other customers turned their attention, sensing the authority and sincerity in his words. The tension shifted subtly, from anger to surprise as everyone processed the unexpected intervention. Carlos felt a wave of relief. The situation was no longer entirely on his shoulders. The man's calm intervention was enough to stabilize the atmosphere. Other customers seemed to recognize it too, nodding slightly and whispering quietly. The impatient customer looked caught off guard, stumbling over his words and muttering complaints that sounded less confident. The man's eyes met Carlos's for a brief moment. There was no need for words. The silent support, the recognition of his composure under pressure was clear. Carlos felt a small surge of gratitude, a reminder that even in the toughest moments, quiet allies could appear in unexpected ways. The impatient customer tried to continue his complaints but found his words faltering. The calm authority of the man in the corner had shifted the dynamic. Carlos handed over another drink with a polite smile. "Here's a fresh latte," he said softly, keeping his tone neutral and professional. The man took it, muttering something quietly, and seemed less aggressive than before. The other customers relaxed slightly, sensing that the peak of tension had passed. Whispers of support and quiet admiration for Carlos spread through the shop. The man in the corner remained near the counter, observing without interfering further, his presence enough to maintain the calm. Carlos continued serving the remaining customers with a renewed sense of confidence. Each interaction was smooth, deliberate, and professional. The small gestures of support from other patrons, combined with the calm authority of the man in the corner, created a subtle but powerful reassurance. The atmosphere in the shop gradually returned to its usual rhythm. By the time the impatient customer finally left, muttering complaints that were quieter and less sharp, Carlos felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. He had navigated the confrontation with patience, professionalism, and grace, and now there was a sense of closure. The quiet support from the man in the corner had been instrumental in stabilizing the situation. In the moments that followed, Carlos wiped down the counter and took a deep breath. He reflected on the afternoon, thinking about the difficult customer, the subtle encouragement from other patrons, and the unexpected intervention. It was a reminder that even in tense situations, patience, professionalism, and quiet support could make all the difference. The man in the corner finally left, offering Carlos a small nod of acknowledgement. Carlos returned it, feeling grateful for the reassurance and encouragement. He knew that challenges would come again, but he also knew that remaining calm and professional could change the outcome of any difficult encounter. Carlos continued his work, preparing drinks and greeting customers. Feeling a renewed sense of purpose, the shop had returned to its normal rhythm, the familiar sounds of conversation, the clinking of cups, and the gentle hum of the espresso machine creating a comforting background. He moved with ease, ready for whatever the rest of the day might bring. The sun dipped lower, painting the shop in warm, golden light. Carlos took a moment to pause, Reflecting on the events of the day, he realized that even when situations seemed overwhelming, there were always ways to navigate them with dignity. The support of others, even in quiet and subtle forms, could have a profound impact. By the end of the day, Carlos had served dozens of customers without incident. Each interaction had been handled with care, and he felt a quiet sense of pride in his work. The experience was a reminder that professionalism, patience, and composure were not just about handling customers. They were about maintaining personal integrity and responding to challenges with grace. As he prepared to close for the day, Carlos straightened the counters, wiped down the espresso machine, and took a final look around the shop. The day had been challenging, but it had also been a powerful lesson in resilience and dignity. He knew that tomorrow would bring new customers, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate patience and professionalism, and he felt ready to face them. Evening had fallen, and the coffee shop had returned to a steady, calm rhythm. The sun was dipping low, painting the windows in shades of orange and pink. Carlos moved behind the counter with practiced ease, cleaning up and preparing for the final customers of the day. The earlier chaos seemed like a distant memory, though he knew it had left a mark. Testing his patience and resolve, the door opened and a few regular customers entered, their cheerful greetings lightening the atmosphere. Carlos responded with a smile, serving them with the same care he always did. The shop hummed with quiet conversation, the clinking of cups and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. It was a comforting environment, a place where he felt in control despite the day's earlier challenges. Carlos reflected on the events of the day, thinking about the impatient customer, the tense moments at the counter, and the subtle support from the man who had quietly observed and then intervened. He realized how important it was to stay calm, professional, and kind, even when others tried to provoke him. It wasn't easy, but the satisfaction of handling a difficult situation with dignity outweighed the frustration. As he served drinks, Carlos noticed a few of the earlier customers whispering and smiling in his direction. Some had been quietly recording the interactions on their phones, capturing the moments of calm and professionalism amidst the tension. He felt a sense of quiet pride, knowing that his composure had been noticed and appreciated. The man who had quietly observed earlier walked in one last time before leaving for the evening. This time he approached Carlos directly, his presence calm and reassuring. "You handled yourself really well today," he said softly with a small, sincere smile. Carlos looked up, surprised and grateful. "Thank you," he replied. "It wasn't easy, but I tried to stay calm and professional." The man nodded. "You did more than that. You showed patience and dignity in a situation that could have gotten out of control. Not everyone would have managed it as well as you did." Carlos felt a wave of appreciation. The acknowledgement meant more than any words of criticism he had faced throughout the day. It was a reminder that integrity and composure mattered, and that people noticed when someone handled themselves with grace. The man gave a final nod and left, blending into the evening crowd. Carlos took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. He returned to the counter, continuing to serve the remaining customers with care and focus. Each drink he prepared, each interaction he had carried a sense of pride and purpose. He knew that his dedication and professionalism had made a difference, not just for the customers but for himself. As the last few patrons finished their drinks and left, Carlos began closing down the shop. He wiped down the counters, cleaned the espresso machine, and organized the supplies for the next day. The quiet evening gave him a moment to reflect, to consider the lessons of the day. Even in the most challenging moments, kindness, patience, and composure could turn the situation around. Carlos thought about the impatient customer, who had returned multiple times, creating tension and frustration. He realized that the man's behavior was not truly about him personally. It was about the customer's own impatience and unhappiness. Understanding that helped Carlos maintain perspective and keep his calm, even when faced with harsh words. He also thought about the man who had intervened quietly, offering support without confrontation. That presence had shifted the energy in the shop, making it possible for the situation to resolve without escalation. Carlos realized that even subtle acts of support could have a profound impact, not just on him but on everyone present. As he finished cleaning, Carlos glanced around the shop, now bathed in the soft glow of the overhead lights. The day had been long and challenging, but it had also been a lesson in resilience, patience, and professionalism. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing he had navigated difficult encounters with dignity and had maintained a sense of integrity throughout. He paused near the counter, reflecting on the importance of recognizing support and encouragement from others. Small gestures, even a nod, a smile, or a quiet presence could make a huge difference in a stressful moment. Carlos felt grateful for the subtle encouragement he had received throughout the day, which had helped him maintain his composure and professionalism. The coffee shop had returned to a peaceful rhythm, the earlier tension replaced by calm and routine. Carlos continued his closing tasks, taking care to leave everything in order for the next day. The familiar sounds of the shop, the soft hum of machines, the gentle clinking of cups created a comforting backdrop, a reminder of the stability and normalcy that followed the chaos. As he finished locking up and preparing to leave, Carlos reflected on the lessons of the day. He understood that patience, professionalism, and calmness were not just about dealing with difficult customers. They were about maintaining personal dignity and integrity. The way he handled challenges reflected his character, and the support of others reminded him that no one faced difficulties alone. Walking out of the shop, Carlos felt a sense of relief and accomplishment. The day had tested him, but he had emerged stronger, more confident, and more aware of the value of composure under pressure. The warm evening air was refreshing, and he felt a lightness in his step, a quiet satisfaction from knowing he had done his best. He thought about the people who had witnessed the events, the regular customers, the quiet observer who had intervened, and even the impatient customer who had tested his patience. Each interaction had taught him something about human behavior, resilience, and the importance of staying calm and professional. As Carlos walked home, he reflected on how unexpected allies could appear in the most unlikely moments. The quiet support of someone who noticed his struggle had been enough to shift the energy, to restore balance, and to make the day's challenges manageable. It was a powerful reminder of the impact of empathy and encouragement. That evening, Carlos felt grateful for the experiences of the day, the challenges, the support, and the opportunity to maintain his dignity. He knew that each day would bring new challenges, but he also knew that he had the strength, patience, and professionalism to face them with grace. As he settled in at home, Carlos replayed the events in his mind not with frustration, but with understanding and acceptance. The day had been difficult, but it had also been a testament to his character. He knew that maintaining composure in the face of adversity was a skill that would serve him well in every aspect of life. He smiled to himself, thinking about the small acts of support that had made a difference, the nod, the quiet presence, the acknowledgement of his efforts. These gestures had reminded him that even in challenging situations there was always hope, kindness, and recognition. Carlos went to bed that night feeling a sense of peace. The day had tested him, but he had emerged stronger, more confident, and more aware of the importance of patience and professionalism. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new customers, and new opportunities to demonstrate his integrity and composure, and he was ready to face them, confident in his ability to handle whatever came his way.